Yeah.
Ever get that, like, pit in your stomach feeling? You know that one when you see, like, flashing lights in your rear view? It's like, ugh, traffic stops, am I right?
The worst.
They can be so nerve-wracking, even when you're, like, 99% sure you didn't do anything wrong.
Totally.
And the thing is, here in Australia, it's not just about the potential ticket.
Right.
It's like, what can the police actually ask of you? What are the boundaries?
Definitely. Knowing your rights is super important.
Which is perfect, because that's what we're diving into today. Your rights during a traffic stop in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And you've sent us some really fascinating legal documents. This isn't just for lawyers and stuff. This is about everyone knowing, like, what to do if you're ever in that situation.
It's about feeling empowered, right?
Yeah.
Not caught off guard.
Exactly. So one thing that really stood out to me is this idea of reasonable suspicion.
Right, because you might think any traffic stop is fair game.
Yeah, like they can just pull you over for anything.
But every single traffic stop, even for something like a license check, it all starts with this reasonable suspicion.
Okay, so break that down for me. Reasonable suspicion, like, what does that actually mean? It's got to be more than just a hunch, right?
Way more. So this particular case, it took place in New South Wales, and the law there is really clear. It's not enough for an officer to just have this feeling about you or your car. There have to be actual articulable facts, something concrete, something a reasonable person would look at and say, okay, I suspect an offense. And we're not just talking theory here. There was a whole court case about this.
Oh, really? Give me the details.
Yeah, it's called RV Rondo. And in that case, the court decided the police didn't have good enough reasonable suspicion to pull the driver over in the first place. And that had big consequences for the case.
Wow. Okay, so those first few seconds of a stop, they really matter. But what happens when an officer's initial reason, like their suspicion, turns out to be wrong? You know, like they pull you over and...
And then they realize they were mistaken.
Exactly. The documents you shared mentioned something called claim jumping.
Yes. It's a bit, well, it can be a tactic.
Sounds manipulative.
Yeah, claim jumping is basically when the officer realizes their first reason for stopping you, maybe it wasn't so strong, so they try to shift their justification, even if they don't have a new valid reason.
So, okay, let me see if I get this. Let's say an officer pulls you over, right, thinking your car is unregistered, but then you show them your registration.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's legit. They can't just suddenly be like, okay, well, now show me your driver's license, just because.
That's exactly it. That's claim jumping, and it shows why it's important to know those boundaries. Officers can't just keep changing the rules as they go, you know? Each action has to be justified.
Totally. So let's talk about the psychological side of this, because I feel like that's a big part of it.
Nah.
I mean, getting pulled over, it could be intimidating. You used a phrase that really stuck with me, war of nerves.
Yeah.
Which sounds intense.
It is intense. It might seem a bit dramatic, but it's about power dynamics. This idea of a war of nerves, it's about tactics officers might use, not physical, but things that might intimidate you, put pressure on you.
Okay, so like what? Give me an example.
Think about it. A really aggressive tone of voice, maybe some implied threats, even just standing way too close. These things can create this climate of fear, even if no one's actually yelling.
Right. Subtle, but so effective.
Exactly.
But how do you know when it crosses the line? Like, isn't that just part of dealing with authority sometimes?
That's a great question, and this is where the law gets really important. Because the legal definition of assault, it's not always about physical contact. Threats, intimidation, making you genuinely afraid, that can all fall under assault too. And there's this case, it really shows you how this works in action. Street v. Bauer, Street v. Blanco. Basically, the court said, just because someone pushes back a little, asserts their rights, even strongly, that doesn't automatically make them suspicious.
It's not like they've got something to hide just because they're standing up for themselves.
Exactly. It's about protecting yourself. Speaking of which, we should talk about some of those rights. Like, first and foremost, you always have the right to know why you're being stopped.
You'd think that'd be obvious, but you're saying I shouldn't just assume they'll tell me.
You'd be surprised. Don't be afraid to ask politely, but firmly. Officer, what's the reason for this stop?
Good to know. Okay, what about staying silent? How much do I actually have to say?
This is huge. Beyond basic ID, like your name and address, you are totally within your rights to stay quiet. It's natural to want to chat, maybe seem cooperative, but just remember, anything you say, it can be used against you.
Wow. So sometimes silence really is golden.
It is, and Section 128 of the Evidence Act backs you up on that. Okay, let's say things escalate. The officer wants to search your car. Do you have to let them?
I would think not, but...
You're right to be cautious. In most cases, you can absolutely refuse a search. unless they have a warrant or what's called probable cause, which is a high bar.
So not just a hunch that I might have something.
Nope. They need strong evidence that there's actually something illegal in your car. And speaking of evidence, remember how we talked about technology?
Oh, right, yeah.
It cuts both ways. You have the right to record the interactions as long as you're not, interfering with the officer's duties. It can actually be really helpful if there are questions about the stop later on. Okay, last one. Can you ask for a lawyer?
I hope so.
Absolutely. You have every right to legal representation. In fact, if something feels off, that's the smartest move you can make.
Like that tap-out option.
Exactly.
So this is all super helpful, but what if, worst case scenario, an officer does violate my rights during a stop? Like, what can I even do about it?
You're not powerless. Really. The system's got ways of dealing with this.
Yeah.
If you believe your rights were violated, you can file a formal complaint. There are police oversight bodies in each state and territory, and they investigate these things. And if that doesn't do it, there's always legal action. You can even sue the officer or the department.
Wow. Okay. So there is a path to accountability, but having proof like notes, recordings, witnesses, that all becomes really important.
It does. Evidence is key.
It's like they say, document, document, document. So we've talked reasonable suspicion, claim jumping, when you can stay quiet. But now things are about to get really interesting because we're going to dive into this unique part of the Australian system, constables as Commonwealth officers. This might seem like a small detail, but trust me, it's a big deal.
It all comes down to how we think about power and who has it.
Set the stage for me. What's so different about constables?
So in Australia, they're not just employees of the police force. They hold this independent office, like under the Commonwealth. It means they have a duty to uphold the law, even if it means going against orders from a superior.
Wait, so they're like independent contractors of the law? That's kind of amazing.
It is. But it's also a double-edged sword. It protects them from having to follow bad orders, but on the flip side, it means they're personally accountable for what they do.
So not just the police force as a whole, but the individual constable is on the hook for their actions.
Exactly. There's a case, Never v. the King, back in 1906, and it really made that clear. A constable's actions are their own. No hiding behind, I was just following orders.
1906. That's wild that it's still relevant.
Right. Speaking of old cases, we have to talk about Monday v. Gill. Now, this one wasn't about a traffic stop, but it's relevant to how we think about police power in general.
Okay, on all ears.
So in this case, the defense did something incredible. They actually forced the prosecution to prove not only that a crime happened, but also that the laws they were using were actually valid.
Whoa, they had to defend the rules themselves.
Yeah. And it's a big deal because it sets a precedent. It suggests that even during a traffic stop, officers should be able to show that their actions are justified. Not just it's the law, but that the law itself is legitimate.
It's about transparency, right? Like knowing where the power comes from.
You got it. And you know that phrase from the documents, controversy on the side of the road?
Oh, yeah, it's kind of perfect.
It really captures that tension. When does a normal stop become something more?
It's a great phrase, right? Controversy on the side of the road. So we know about all these rights, these rules, but when does a normal traffic stop? Like what tips it over into that controversy territory?
Well, a lot of it goes back to what we've been talking about, that initial reasonable suspicion. If the officer can't explain why they pulled you over right from the start, it makes everything else shaky.
It's like if the foundation's off, the whole house is.
Exactly. And then there's the claim jumping. Changing their story in the middle without a good reason, that's a bad sign.
Yeah, no fair moving the goalposts once the...
Right. Then there's how long the stop goes on. Even if they had a reason to pull you over, they can't just keep you there forever. It should only last as long as it needs to address that initial reason, you know?
Right, right. And of course, there's the intimidation factor, that whole war of nerves thing.
Huge red flag. If they're using intimidation, pressure, trying to get around those legal rules, something's not right.
You mentioned mixed war earlier, and how does that fit into all of this?
That's interesting you bring that up. So in the documents, it's not about traffic stops specifically. It's more like in a war when you have a government, but then also like rebel groups. It's a mix of who you're dealing with.
Okay, so you're saying that an officer, especially a constable, who's supposed to be so independent, if they start acting outside the rules, it's like their own
mixed war on the side of the road. Yeah, exactly. Like they're not just representing the law anymore. It's personal.
Whoa. That's kind of scary. This has been so eye-opening, honestly. We've covered a lot, all those cases, and like the law itself. What's the one thing you want our listener to really take away from all of this?
I think at the end of the day, knowing your rights, that's powerful. When you understand how it all works, those obligations, the pitfalls, it's like you can relax a little,
Yeah,
You're prepared.
totally. Okay, before we wrap up completely, can we go over those rights one more time just so everyone's got them?
Of course, you have the right to know why you're being stopped. You can stay silent. You can refuse a search in most cases. You can record the interaction if it's not interfering. And if anything feels off, ask for a lawyer. Don't forget those.
It's so important.
No.
Okay, as we finish up this deep dive, any final thoughts, something we didn't talk about but that people should keep in mind?
This is just the beginning, The law changes. What's okay in one place might not be okay in another. It's always evolving. So stay curious.
Do your research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you need to, get some extra legal advice.
This isn't the end. It's like...
Start of your legal adventures.
Yes. Okay, listener, we hope this was helpful, empowering, all that good stuff. Remember, knowledge is power. Stay safe out there. And until next time.
Keep those legal headlights shining bright.